Hi everyone. So I just finished processing this image of the California Nebula and I'm super happy with how it turned out. And as I was going through it, there were a few things that occurred to me that I thought might be nice to make a quick video on. First of all, this was pretty straightforward, a pretty quick process that I did on this. So I wanted to show you kind of the steps of that. And then lastly, the impact of a few things in terms of the aesthetics at the very end that I feel for me really took this from being an image that I was okay with to one that I was really, really happy with at the end. So jumping into the processing flow here, to start off with, really did just have the narrowband images, that you would typically get if you were working for the backyard. So my hydrogen alpha, which is really where the bulk of the data and detail kind of come in from. And then the S2 channel, which is really important on the color side for this kind of mainly hydrogen nebula, because it just allows for certain areas to get a little bit more pop to them, which is really going to be important in that final color combine. And then lastly, the O3 channel, which is darn near nothing in this particular nebula. There is a little bit here. This isn't just gradient. I did do kind of the background removal here. That does add a little bit, but mainly I got the O3 for the background, to kind of have the stars kind of have. They don't have a lot of color in here, but I find that it gives them a little bit more natural color and that kind of thing. So starting with those three here, and the first real step that I end up doing is trying to make sure that the background values for all of these match up. It just makes combining them into a color image a lot more smoother process. So for that, I'm doing the linear fit process. Sorry, I'm in a different screen resolution, so I had to find it here. Linear fit. So the idea with the linear fit process is you pick one of your images. In this case, I'm normally using the hydrogen alpha exposure, and then just applying it to each of the other images. And then all that's going to do is get everything fit to the same basic kind of intensity. And once that's done, and you've done a background extraction on it to kind of get rid of the big gradients, then you're ready to move on to combining the channels here. So with that channel combine, you're just picking which one you want to go to each place. I know I've gone over this in other videos, so I'm not going to dwell on it here. But in this particular case, I did the standard Hubble palette. So that's the hydrogen alpha into red, the S2 into green, and then the oxygen into blue for the HSO combination. And so combining those through did this image here for me. And at first glance, this is pretty good, right? I can tell I've got a lot of fine kind of detail coming out. I do notice I've got kind of a green cast across the whole thing, and the auto stretch on this is honestly way too bright for what I'm going to want it to be at the end of the day. But that's good. And the thing that I like most about it off the bat is, I'm not going to have like a bunch of different colors in this because there wasn't a lot of O3 data, but in this area between the bright spots and the little bit dimmer spots of the nebula, I am getting kind of that orange to red transition. There's a lot of variation in there, so that lets me know that I'm going to have a lot to play around with as I go here. So from that, just looking at the history here, the first thing that I'm doing on this is a background neutralization. So as I said, I've got this green cast. I could run an SCNR on this, but sometimes doing that just to fix your background here at the early stages kind of kills your colors in the rest of the image. So what I did is just did a little preview there and ran the background neutralization job, and that is going to, I noticed that did a lot here. I had a lot of background to neutralize, so hitting the STF again, you notice a lot of that green is just gone, and that lets a lot of these kind of almost purplish areas kind of start to come out more. Moving on, then I move into my linear transform, which this is really my first level of noise reduction process here. Now, if you notice, I've got a couple of masks that I used in a few areas there. So this one, this image 28 mask, it's just a gray image. And reason why I'm doing that is I noticed from time to time when I'm doing my noise reduction, it's just too strong. It's just doing too much. And so looking at that, I have a saved kind of preset of noise reduction that in general works pretty well for me. And there's two things that I want to try to keep in mind when I'm doing my noise reduction. First is I want to attack the noise in this background more than I want to attack the noise in the high signal area. You do that with this linear mask area. So the cool thing about the linear mask, if you click on the preview mask box and then do the real-time preview, it'll let you see what the mask it is that it's going to make. Let me not invert it, a little bit easier to see here. You can play with this amplification slider to see how much you want to protect these higher signal versus lower signal areas. And what I found, sometimes you're really trying to get your highest signal areas pretty close to white overall, and sometimes that may take turning the amplification up a lot in order to get there, but just kind of trying to play around with that. And then at the end you want to invert it because that's kind of the best way to do that, to make sure that you're getting it in the right area. But outside of just setting that mask up, that'll handle the I want to attack this more than this. But I find sometimes running this process will make things, it'll hit it too hard and things will look a little plasticky. And especially in your background, where that becomes a problem is you notice there's already some just kind of light and dark variation in the background to begin with. Your noise reduction, if it goes at it too hard, that's where you'll get this blotchy kind of background where those dark areas kind of get combined together into dark spots and the lighter areas get combined into light spots, and it gets really hard to deal with those later on. So what I do for that is I use that gray image that I was talking about here. So this is literally just a flat gray image, and the way that I make that is using pixel math. So you pull up pixel math, you can literally just punch in 0.5, all color value or all values in pixels for PixInsight are between 0 and 1, right? So 0.5 is straight down the middle. Tell it you want to create a new image out of this and just apply it to your current image. And what that'll do is make an image with the exact same dimensions, so it'll work for a nice mask as your original image, but just give you flat gray. And putting that 50%, that 0.5 mask on will cut the intensity of any process you're doing by half. That can be really helpful in some of these where they don't even have like an intensity slider. But in noise reduction, if you want to adjust the intensities here, you're kind of doing it layer by layer. I've set up one that does a pretty good job overall, but in some images it's just too much. So I'll apply that 50% mask and see what that does for me. And in this case, doing that's the difference. It's kind of subtle on here, and I'll go back and forth once or twice. But you can see that a lot of the speckles are just gone, but it still leaves some noise in there. And for me, that's fine. And looking at the high signal area, there's actually even more speckling left. But once again, that's fine because I've got more detail coming out, so it's not as apparent. And for me, I've just noticed that that's worked well, is doing a little bit less noise reduction, because honestly, most of the time, pixel peeping, if I'm all the way out here, I'm sure on YouTube you can't even tell the difference between the two here, right? So it's really more when you're zooming in a lot that it starts to come in. But I have noticed that if I overdo the noise reduction and I'm looking at this image on my iPad later, the background just starts standing out for its blotchiness. You don't notice the speckly as much as you notice blotchy. So that's why I tend to underdo the noise reduction sometimes. So after the noise reduction piece on this, then I'm going to go ahead and stretch the image. I could do things like deconvolution or other things like that. I just chose not to do it on this one. While there is a lot of detail in here, I found just trying to do deconvolution wasn't really getting me much, return for what I was putting into it. So I just skipped it. So go ahead and stretch the image. Let's take off our auto stretch here. And then you can tell I didn't push it as far as the normal stretch goes. So when looking at the screen transfer function, sorry, all this is squished out a little bit longer because of my normal higher resolution, but before the stretch that we had here and having things kind of at automatic, what I'll do a lot of times is, instead of taking exactly this because it's going to stretch the background probably a little too high, is I can drag this slider down to the point where I feel like I'm kind of seeing everything I wanted to see, but my background is looking a lot more closer to the level that I want to do it. And then that's the stretch. I'll move into the histogram transformation and pull over. So that's how I ended up with this stretch here. It just, in my mind, is a lot easier than trying to just do the quick stretch into the final stretch. And then trying to darken things up later. I found that tends to not work well for me. So now that we've got this here, the next steps we're really moving into TGV denoise. So TGV is just the next denoise tool that I really use a lot. I got some saved numbers that I pulled from a tutorial out there, and then apply it from there. In my case, sometimes I'm using that same kind of mask. In this case, I didn't, because I found that it was doing a pretty good job. But on the TGV side, once again, it's probably really subtle for YouTube. I'll zoom in a lot here to where you can see the individual speckles, and then TGV just kind of does a nice pass of cleaning them up. It's a really, really nice tool there. So you can feel free to, screenshot or pause this to grab my particular settings I've got here. You can see I'm not even using the local support on this. And then there's a lot of tutorials on how you can really fine-tune TGV for things like your for galaxies and things like that, to get the most out of it. But in my case, the particular options I had on this one were working pretty well. And so even on the background here, there's just a lot of, especially the color noise, just going away. I still got a lot of speckly in here, but I'm honestly not too worried about it, because once again, zoomed out, I'm not noticing it at all. And I'd rather not notice it at all than make things too plasticky. So after TGV, I go into this HDR multi-scale transform process. This is a really wordy way of saying it's trying to do the kinds of things that you would see in an HDR photo, where it's trying to say something isn't going to be too dark or too bright. It's going to try to show the levels of detail in between. So in here, what that really ends up doing is popping these detail lines out. So you can tell, going back through here, things just get a lot more defined. It almost feels like you're sharpening it, but really what you're doing is allowing more contrast to show up in the brighter and darker areas within that same range. And so for me, if I had to pick one process that I wanted to have, I would rather have this one than deconvolution. A lot of people swear by deconvolution for sharpening things up, but I find sharpening, in my opinion, isn't as important as that contrast. The contrast is what makes things pop and lets you feel the definition of things. So I really love the HDR medium scale transform, whatever it's called. I just call it the HDR-MT. Then next I move into the local histogram equalization, the LHE. So this one is kind of a two-step. So now that I've added in some of this depth here, sometimes that can feel a little, it can get rid of some of the, in my opinion, the fluffiness, for lack of a better term, that I like to see, especially in like cloudy objects like this. So the local histogram equalization can kind of do that, bring that back out, where maybe this got darkened down a little too much and kind of can blend it in a little bit better. So the two-step of that is I run it first with this 50 kernel radius, which is pretty small, and that's going to help areas like this dark kind of dusty area here. And then I run it again at a larger radius, like 150, that's going to help some of the larger structures, and getting that there. So I kind of zoom in to this area here, and so here's the first pass of the local histogram equalization. If you can see, it just kind of lightens some of this area that maybe got brought down into it a little too much. And some of these areas here, it kind of helps bring back some of that glow that may have gotten lost by doing the HDR. And then with the larger radius, so once again, this is what I'm seeing with the lighter radius. So it's, you know, kind of very much in these smaller scales. And then with the larger radius, you can tell it's hitting these longer stretches of clouds. So this is the longer one back and forth. It just kind of helps with some of the pop, you know, because without either of them backing up twice, in my opinion, it feels a little flat. But once I pop those two in there, I feel like I've got more kind of glow and like I said, my term of fluffiness being added back in. So the next thing after the histogram equalization is just a curves. In this case, it was just a curves for saturation. I just kind of wanted to pop up the red value a little bit more. So, you know, kind of going from there to there. I like to do the saturation after all the histogram stuff, so that I have my brightness kind of where I want it to be. And once again, you could be doing a lot of this a lot more slowly on, like, say, just the luminance layer, and then playing around with the colors and separate channels. And I've certainly done all that. In this one, I feel like I really didn't need it. You know, the data was really good quality, and I was really happy with where I was with it. You know, I didn't feel like I needed to go that much further in there. And so next is another run of multi-scale linear transform. So in this case, it's a little bit different. First time I ran it was as a noise reduction pass, right? And I'm really using this noise reduction area. The next time I'm using it is as a sharpening tool. So instead of using this noise reduction area, really using the bias area this time. And it's looking at just the first few layers in the image. So layers and pix insight, I won't go into it too crazy depth, but each time you go up a layer, you're looking at something that goes across more pixels in a time as a structure. So something that's 1 or 2 would be either really just a noise, like 1 pixel or 2 pixels, or you start getting into a pieces of a star here and there. And by the time you get up to like layers 7, 8, 9, 10 and above, you're looking at big swaths of cloud, right? But when you want to look at, say, like the wispier pieces in here, that kind of thing, sharpening up some of those details, that's going to be this like kind of 2 to 5 range, typically, depending on, you know, how big a part of your image it is. And so, you know, this is just kind of a saved set, once again, of things that tend to work pretty well. And so applying those through gives you a quick little sharpening pass. So probably, once again, hard to see at the full zoom out, but when we zoom in here, it's just popping a little bit more definition. It isn't actually going through and doing, you know, a sharpening routine. It's just kind of deconstructing the image and giving more emphasis, more bias to things at certain structures as it goes through. And once again, it's very subtle, but that's what you want out of sharpening. You want it to be subtle and not crazy. So I do that first, and the next one is I apply an actual unsharp mask, which is, you know, kind of just like you would have in Photoshop here, and that is doing a sharpening routine, but it's at a much lower amount than I might do it if that was the only thing I was doing on its own. So after, so once again, starting with the multi-scale sharpening and then the unsharp mask sharpening, working in tandem. Now, the unsharp mask sharpening is always going to add a little bit more speckle into things, and that's why I like doing the other one as well, is it just kind of keeps the noise from getting crazy. So once again, backed out here, starting with no sharpening and then doing the 2 pieces of it, 1, 2. Very subtle at the whole image, but it does make an impact if you're going to zoom in to any of the pieces there. Now that I've done that, as I mentioned, the unsharp mask adds some speckly noise back in. Now that I've finished doing that, that's when I'm going to run the morphological transformation. Now, the names on all of this are kind of crazy versus what you're actually using it for. This is my star reduction. So, I've kind of finished working on the Nebula piece, and I want to drop out some of the stars. Doing this after the unsharp mask means that it'll kind of attack some of this speckly stuff too. So here's the image normal, and then after running the morphological transformation, you can see how much those stars just kind of wink down a little bit. Now, if you go too crazy on that, you can start really eating into the detail of your nebula. So, that's why I'll normally run this with 2 iterations on it, so that if it's doing it too much, I can just change it to 1 and then run it without having to really try to mess with these sliders off of, after I've got a default number that I'm kind of okay with, that kind of thing. So just messing with the iterations is normally good enough for me there. So now I've reduced the stars, and the next thing in the process here is the final SCNR. So as I mentioned, I didn't do the SCNR at the beginning. I did the background neutralization, but there's still a little bit more green cast, especially if I kind of auto stretch this up. I can still see a certain amount of green in there, that kind of thing. So then I'll run the SCNR with just the default, color to remove green, leaving it as neutral, 100%. And be probably hard to tell much difference in here, but like I said, if I had it auto stretched and I run it, the green just kind of fades out from all of this here. So just a helpful little pass to get rid of some of the extra cast from the green that we really didn't want in the final image there. And so once that was done, I was pretty much ready to go. Maybe a final tweak on the curves or something like that. But this image was pretty much done, and I could have called it at that. And I wasn't ready to. I wasn't happy with it. The California Nebula is something that I shot last year in black and white, and I also did again as part of the deep dive into live stacking video I did a few weeks ago. And I love this nebula. It's a really easy target to get some good info out of, or good detail out of. It should look better than this, in my opinion. And when I had done it before, I had done it on its side, actually trying to look a little bit like the state of California, right? And so, originally, I think counterclockwise. Originally it kind of was looking like this, but tilted a little bit more, right? And this doesn't look bad by any means, but I wanted to have a different view, which is why I went for it sideways this time. But I felt like the whole time I was processing it, that it just wasn't striking me. Even though I did all the things I felt like I needed to do, I got a lot of nice detail out of these clouds. Looking at any one part of the image, I was feeling really good with how the data, kind of turned out, and the aesthetics of it, and I like the colors of it. But I was like, I don't know. It just isn't grabbing me. And so I knew that I was probably going to do some cropping in, especially since it's a little off center in here, that kind of thing. And so, I was going to crop it in, so I'll just start playing around with that. And even my initial crop, I was kind of like, I don't know. I don't like it that much. So I started saying, well, maybe if I do that same kind of rotation So I tried it counterclockwise first, and I was like, yeah, it's all right. Um, and I even said, okay, well, let's rotate it the other way. Let's go clockwise. And it's like, oh, that's not bad. That's kind of interesting. But at the same point in time, that one didn't really hit me either. And then I just did rotated 180 degrees. And as soon as I did that, for me, it just stood out to me of like, oh, okay, like all of a sudden the way the clouds were moving, the focus of it, kind of shifted in my eye. Of I felt this ridge here and this one here, and it felt like everything kind of had a direction that it was facing with the curve. And then with the star there, it felt like the star was either pushing it out or falling down kind of into it. And all of a sudden I went, that's what I needed. I needed to flip it around here. And then basically at that point, that set my focus. I said, this is what I'm drawn to. This whole area here, with it being really wide. So then that became the crop that I wanted to go for. So pulling open the dynamic crop here. And I just started saying, okay, so I want it. Let me just bring it in a little bit. Oh. I want to do that, and then I want to try to capture the wispy detail at the bottom here. And then instantly, in my opinion, it was a much better image, right? And I knew I was going to crop it in. I was doing pretty wide field anyways, but it wasn't until I started rotating it around and trying to look at it from different points of view that it really struck me. At that point, all of this, and it may just be that it felt more like thunderhead clouds or something, right? With that kind of flat bottom going into the big billowing top, that kind of thing. Or, where the star was with this, or the curve, or just the wide nature of it, tilting up instead of tilting down. For whatever reason, that's where the image in my head went from, okay, I got it, and I think I did my best with it, to, oh, I really, really love this image now. And, so that was the final kind of crop that I ended up with here. Like I said, the only other thing was like maybe a little bit of curves to bring down the black in here. And then saving that off into the full final here. Now, once again, is this as noise reduced as it could be? No, I can still see some speckle in here and that kind of thing. But when I get to the background here, it's not chewed up, right? It's speckly, but I'm not seeing like weird spider veiny noise artifacts, right? And that kind of thing. I'm not seeing big, dark, blotchy spots giving to a bunch of light, blotchy spots. It's a lot more randomized out through there. As the noise level. And so even pixel peeping on this one, it feels better to me than if I had overdone the noise reduction. So keeping that noise reduction kind of simple is what really, really worked for me. And is this as sharp as it could be? No, not by any means. There's tons more detail that could probably be brought out with a really good run on deconvolution and min-maxing a lot of other things. But am I really going to be looking at it at that level, or am I looking at it at this level? I feel like I'm looking at it at this level. And even if, maybe I wasn't going to be able to frame in as well as I could have there, playing around with those crops can be really important to maybe even just saving an image, right? So, if I'm looking at this one, and maybe I had some weird artifacting or gradients I couldn't get rid of, I think something like this is probably a pretty good crop too. If I come in here, let's make this a little bit bigger so we can zoom in. That's not bad, right? It's not crazy detailed, but I like kind of almost what feels like the painting nature of this, right? And so all that other stuff that I had out there, if my background was kind of bad or whatnot, I could just crop in a little bit and just show more of it. Am I getting the whole nebula? Have I done the postage stamp to show that I've got it? Maybe not, right? I think we all have, when we first start, the postage stamp phase where we go, okay, I got M1, I got M2, I got M78, I got M42. And you're not really as focused on, did I get it great, more than I just got it. I've never taken a picture of it before. And that's awesome. But as you come back and start shooting these targets in year number 2 or in year number 3, you want to start finding the things that you haven't done before. Maybe it's spending more hours on the actual exposure time. Or in my case, I'm really focused right now on this kind of depth of color that we're coming through. This is still basically a bicolor image. Yes, I've got O3 in it, but as we saw at the beginning, there isn't a lot of O, so it's still essentially a bicolor image, but there's a lot of color depth in here. And then the other part of it is that I want to try to do things I haven't seen a lot of before. I've seen a lot of California nebulas honestly turn the other way around. A lot of them where it's just, oh, sorry, this is the wrong one. A lot of them where you're looking at it like this, kind of. Because when you first set up your scope, if you have your camera roughly, straight on your scope, up, down, this is the image that's coming off, or they'll do that 90 degree on it, which is what I did last year, right? And even what I did, I think, in the stacking video, where you're really trying to show off that why it's called the California Nebula. Also, not a bad way to go either. But it also, in my opinion, is something that I've seen a lot of before. So when going for mine, this view of it felt new to me. And it isn't just the orientation. I'm sure I've seen plenty of them like that. But my particular crop in and framing, having the bright star there, that kind of stuff, this particular kind of color dynamic to it versus it being just kind of like HARGB, where you get a lot of kind of the normal color and then everything's just red across here. It wasn't doing it for me. So that's where, I find my creativity in this, is what do I find exciting about this target that I haven't already seen a bunch of times. So I hope that was kind of helpful to you as you guys think about your own images. None of this has to be, the end all be all, right? California Nebula is one of the brightest targets out there. Everyone's taking pictures of it. But there's a difference when it's your picture, right? And you can start off with hydrogen alpha that is going to be just kind of gorgeous on its own, right? I mean, the black and white of this, you can get so much detail out of, even with just playing around with the screen transfer function. Just sliding this down. I mean, look how much depth and detail there is just in the black and white, right? No additional processing, just calibration and removing background. And that's where you can start. That's exactly what I did last year, and it was one of my favorite things. And I wasn't ready to do multiple narrowband filters. So just do one and make sure I can get it working, right? And then you come back to it a year later, and you just can take a whole new pass at it and have a whole new lease on how you're feeling about that image and that target. Those two images can live completely next to each other in your gallery of photos that you've taken, and you can feel equally good about both of them because you took a different set of eyes on it and twirled it around a new direction or cropped in on it a little bit differently, and that kind of thing. So that's it this time. Hope you guys had fun with that. Feel free to keep leaving me comments. I'm really enjoying, seeing you guys that are either inspired to do new things in your own work, or asking questions as you're working to get things set up on your end. That's super gratifying to me. I was definitely a YouTube viewer of these kinds of videos from other folks as I was getting started, and I'm really happy that for some of you out there, at least, this is helping you along in your own processing or own kind of journey in this hobby as well. So that's it for this time, and until next time, I wish everybody clear skies. Thanks.